There's a quiet myth in Beatles history that George Harrison was content being the third Beatle, happy to stand behind the towering partnership of Lennon and McCartney. But that couldn't be further from the truth. George wasn't just a guitarist. He was a songwriter, one whose creative voice grew stronger with every record. Yet for most of the 1960s, his songs were treated as afterthoughts, squeezed between Lennon-McCartney anthems. John and Paul admired him, but they didn't always take him seriously. By the late 60s, that frustration was boiling over, and George's response was to write songs filled with longing, sarcasm, and spiritual tension. Here are 10 George Harrison songs that frustrated Lennon and McCartney, the ones that forced them to realize just how much they'd underestimated him. Number 10. Think for Yourself, 1965.
I've got a word or two to say.
Recorded during the Rubber Soul sessions, Think for Yourself was George finding his voice and sharpening it. It wasn't a love song or a psychedelic experiment. It was a jab, directed at hypocrisy, conformity, and maybe, just maybe, at his own bandmates. Paul played fuzz bass, adding grit to the song's cynical tone. But Lennon and McCartney didn't quite understand it. They saw George as moralistic, too serious, too cryptic. In truth, Harrison was evolving faster than they realized. His lyrics had bite, his perspective had weight, and his patience was wearing thin. Think for Yourself was George quietly saying, "Stop telling me what to do." Number 9. If I Needed Someone, 1965. When If I Needed Someone came out, it showed George could write something as melodically sharp as Paul, but with his own harmonic twist. Inspired by the Byrds and Indian ragas, it had jangly guitars and an emotional coolness that Lennon found intriguing and slightly annoying. Paul later admitted he didn't think much of it, calling it pleasant but nothing special. That casual dismissal stung. For George, it wasn't about rivalry. It was about recognition. If I Needed Someone was one of the first songs that proved he wasn't just filling album space. But Lennon and McCartney still treated it like a B-side to their brilliance. George, meanwhile, was realizing he might have to leave their shadow to find his light. Number 8. Taxman, 1966.
Let me tell you how it will be.
By Revolver, George was done being quiet. Taxman was biting, political, and unmistakably bold, a full-on attack on Britain's oppressive tax system. But the real sting? John and Paul didn't initially want it as the album's opener. They didn't think a Harrison song could set the tone for a Beatles record. When George insisted, Paul ended up playing the blistering guitar solo, partly because he could nail it quickly, partly because Harrison wasn't given time to refine his own take. George wasn't pleased. It became one of the most famous tracks of the era, but the resentment lingered. Taxman wasn't just about money, it was about control. Harrison wanted respect, and he had to fight for every inch of it. Number 7. Within You, Without You, 1967. By the time Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came around, George had fully embraced Indian music and spirituality. Within You, Without You wasn't just a song. It was a philosophy. But Lennon and McCartney didn't get it. To them, it was too long, too strange, too far from the Beatles' pop sensibility. John later admitted he admired the courage, but not the sound. Paul, though polite, thought it killed the album's flow. George didn't care. He recorded it mostly without them, surrounded by Indian musicians, exploring sitar textures and meditative rhythms. It was the ultimate statement of independence, and a not-so-subtle message to his bandmates. You don't need to understand it. You just need to respect it. Number 6. The Inner Light, 1968.
Without going out of my door,
The Inner Light continued George's exploration of Eastern philosophy, but this time it was even more personal. Recorded in Bombay with Indian session musicians, it was released as the B-side to Lady Madonna. Paul liked it, but as a novelty. John called it beautiful but foreign, unsure how it fit the Beatles' identity. For George, that was exactly the problem. His art was expanding beyond the band, but his bandmates still saw it as exotic decoration. He later admitted it hurt him that his most spiritual work was treated like a curiosity. The Inner Light was his quiet triumph, and their quiet failure to recognize it. Number 5. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, 1968.
look at you all, see the love.
By the White Album, George had reached a breaking point. He'd been writing songs every bit as good as Lennon or McCartney's, but still had to fight to get even one on the record. While My Guitar Gently Weeps was his masterpiece. But during early sessions, John and Paul didn't take it seriously. They dismissed it as too slow, too sentimental, and refused to give it the energy it deserved. So George did something unexpected. He called his friend Eric Clapton. Clapton's searing guitar solo transformed the track, and suddenly everyone paid attention. John and Paul realized, maybe for the first time, that George didn't need their approval to create greatness. Later, George recalled the moment with quiet bitterness. It was typical. I had to bring in someone else before they'd even listen. Number 4. Piggies, 1968.
Have you seen the little piggies crawling in the dirt?
If Gently Weeps was George's cry for respect, Piggies was his bite of sarcasm. On the surface, it was a playful social satire, mocking greed, consumerism, and hypocrisy. But underneath, it was George lashing out at the establishment, and maybe again at the hierarchy within the Beatles themselves. Lennon found it too moralistic. McCartney thought it was cute but strange. Both underestimated it. Ironically, the song would later gain dark notoriety when it was misinterpreted by Charles Manson, something that horrified George. But even before that, Piggies stood as proof that George could write commentary just as biting as Lennon's, and perhaps with more subtlety. Behind the humor was frustration, the sound of a man tired of being told to play nice while others got to roar. Number 3. Not Guilty, 1968.
Not guilty.
Recorded during the White Album sessions, Not Guilty is George Harrison's open letter to Lennon and McCartney, and it's scathing. The lyrics are full of defiance. I'm not trying to steal your vest, I'm not trying to be smart. Those weren't random words. They were directed straight at John and Paul, who George felt had been undermining him creatively for years. He recorded the song over 100 times, but it still didn't make the album. John thought it was too negative. Paul didn't think it fit the vibe. For George, that was the final straw. Even when he poured his truth into a song, they shut him out. Decades later, he admitted Not Guilty was him trying to defend his place in a band that didn't always see him as an equal. When it was finally released on Anthology 3 in 1996, fans could finally hear what John and Paul had missed: the frustration, the sarcasm, and the sound of a man being quietly erased from his own story. Number 2, Something, 1969. Ironically, the song that frustrated Lennon and McCartney the most was one of George's biggest triumphs. Something was so good that even Frank Sinatra called it the greatest love song ever written. But when George first brought it to the band, Paul nitpicked the arrangement, and John barely paid attention. George later said, "It took them a long time to realize I could write." Paul eventually contributed a beautiful bass line, but not without trying to reshape the song. John didn't even play on it. Still, Something became a #1 hit, the first Harrison-written Beatles song to do so. It was poetic justice. After years of being overlooked, George had written a song that surpassed even Lennon and McCartney's standards. But for George, the victory was bittersweet. He'd proven his worth, but it only highlighted how long he'd been underestimated. Number 1, All Things Must Pass, 1969.
Sunrise doesn't last.
By 1969, George had evolved into a world-class songwriter. All Things Must Pass was spiritual, wise, and deeply human. The kind of song that could have been the emotional centerpiece of Let It Be. But Lennon dismissed it. Paul said it didn't sound like the Beatles. George tried again and again to record it during the Get Back sessions, but it was ignored in favor of John's half-finished ideas and Paul's pop sketches. It was the final confirmation he needed. They'd never fully see him as an equal. When the Beatles broke up, George took All Things Must Pass with him. It became the title track of his legendary solo album, one that outshone both Lennon's and McCartney's first solo efforts. The message of the song, "Everything changes, everything fades," was both spiritual and personal. It was George letting go of his resentment even as he rose above it. As he once said, "They never took me seriously, until it was too late."